there folks, Mr. G here with another educational video. This time we're going to be talking about fractions, decimals, and percentages and how they relate to one another. Now we've talked about this a couple of times in the past. We've been working with percentages last time. We did a whole unit on fractions, so we're pretty confident with those two. And I just want to show you kind of how we can go between all of these and why we might use a fraction versus a decimal versus a percentage. So as we've seen, we can go between all three. We've done the conversion between fractions, decimals, and percentages, and they can all represent the same value or the same number. But sometimes it's easier to use or sometimes easier to understand the situation and the number if it has a different form. Sometimes it's easier to understand or use as a fraction, decimal, or a percentage. Fractions are really helpful if we want to try and understand our number in relation to the whole. So for instance, if we think about 2/3 of our cake is left, that gives us an idea of how much we have versus the whole. It's very explicit. If there was a statistic like 1 in 5 people, this is also really nice as a fraction, 1 out of 5, really easy to understand what this means. Percentages are used in a similar way where we're thinking of part of a whole, but when the fraction is a lot less nice. So what I mean by that is imagine we had a statistic like 68.7% of students do their homework, right? We could represent this as a fraction. This would be the same as 68.7 out of 100, but that doesn't really give you the same intuition as some of these simpler ones are. So this fraction is great if the numbers are nice and clean. Percentages, sort of a similar idea, right? It gives us that intuitive sense of a part to a whole, but it doesn't work as well to use a fraction when our numbers are like 68.7%. So when the numbers are a little bit messier, oftentimes that's where percentages look really good and can be a better way of understanding our values. Decimals aren't particularly useful for understanding numbers, but they are really good for formulas and calculations. If we wanted to figure out 5% of $10, we know that of means times, so that would be like 5% times $10. But if we wanted to get the correct answer here, we actually need to turn this 5% into a decimal before we punch it into our calculator. Otherwise, we're going to get the wrong answer. 5% of $10 is actually 50 cents, but if we didn't turn it into a decimal, we would get the answer of $50, which doesn't make any sense. That's 5 times bigger, which is not what 5% means. So when we use percentages in equations like this, we need to make sure they are decimals. And decimals are really helpful in these formulas and when we're doing calculations. So a lot of times you'll find that you'll take percentages or fractions, turn them into decimals for the calculation, and then maybe back into percentages or decimals at the end. Now that we understand where these might be useful, let's go over how we would convert from one to the other in a lot of different situations and some of the weirder cases that maybe we haven't seen yet. So let's imagine we start with a percentage. We've got two examples here, and we want to convert both of these to a decimal or to a fraction. As we know, when we talked about percentages last time, converting from percentages to decimals and vice versa is super simple. All we have to do is move our decimal place. The only thing you have to worry about is which direction. Remember that when we go from a percentage to a decimal is always smaller than a percentage. So we need to move our decimal place so that we get a smaller number, which means that we have to move it to the left, and we always move it by 2. So our decimal for 140% would just be 1.4. Similarly here, now we're moving our decimal place to the left again, but notice that once we move it to the left twice, we've got this gap here. Anytime you have a gap here, you need to make sure you put a 0 there. You can even put a 0 on the other side here if that helps you see it. So it should be 0.0825. So that would be our answer as a decimal. Now converting this into a fraction is a little bit trickier, but remember that a percentage means out of 100. So when we have 140%, this is the same as 140 out of 100, or 140 over 100. Once we have it here, all we have to do is reduce our fraction. Notice that both the top and the bottom are divisible by 10 because they both end in a 0. And then from here, both of our numbers are even, so we can divide by 2, and there would be our answer as a fraction. Same thing when we have a decimal percentage. It's still 8.25 out of 100, but we're not really allowed to have decimals as part of our fraction, so what we need to do is get rid of the decimal on the top by multiplying the top and bottom by the same number. So if we want to move our decimal place back by 2 on the top here, that's the same as multiplying by 100. So we got to do the same thing to the bottom, otherwise the value of our fraction is going to change. So multiplying by 100, that moves our decimal place back by 2. Same thing here, it would move it back by 2. And we would get this as our fraction. Now I know this looks kind of scary, but we can reduce this. You'll notice that both of our numbers end in a 5, so we can divide the top and the bottom by 5. They still both end in a 5 or a 0, so we can divide the top and bottom by 5. And once we get it to this point, you can check for yourself, but there are no other numbers we can reduce this by, so this would be our final answer for our fraction. Let's imagine we start with a decimal, say these two decimals, and we want to convert them to a percentage and to a fraction. So starting decimal to percentage, we did this last time, super easy. All you have to do is remember which way you move, 2 to the left or 2 to the right. In this case, when we go to a percentage, our number should be bigger, so we have to move to the right in order to make that happen. This would be 328%. Same thing for this one, move it 2 to the right here, we get 1.25%. Taking our decimal and converting into a fraction is a little bit trickier, but actually it looks very similar to converting a percentage to a fraction. If you remember, when we had whole numbers like, I don't know, 6, and we wanted to turn them into a fraction, this was the same as 6 over 1. And this also works for decimal numbers. So 3.28 is the same as 3.28 over 1, because dividing by 1 doesn't do anything. But notice, now we have a fraction. And the only thing we need to do to make this a real fraction is get rid of the decimal on top. So what we'll do is multiply the top and bottom by the same number to get rid of this decimal. We want to move it by 2 decimal places, that's the same as multiplying by 100, so we got to do the same thing on the bottom here too. And that would be our fraction, except we still need to reduce it. We can divide the top and bottom by 4 here, and we'll get a final fraction of 82 over 25. If you didn't see that we could divide by 4, you could have divided by 2 twice, and you would have gotten to the same thing. We use the same trick even if we got a big decimal like this, or I guess a really small decimal. We still put it over 1, and now we got to think about what are we multiplying the top and bottom by to get rid of these decimal places. Well, we're moving our decimal back 4 times, so that means we would have to multiply by 1 with 4 zeros next to it. That's a helpful trick when you're doing this multiplication. Every decimal place you move, that's like a 1, and you keep adding zeros to the end. So if we do 2 decimal places, that's 1 and 2 zeros, so 100. If we're moving it 4 decimal places, that's a 1 with 4 zeros after it, or 10,000. This looks really scary, but notice both of these end in a 5 or a 0, so we can divide both by 5. Still both end in a 5 or a 0, divide by 5. Still both end in a 5 or a 0, so we can divide by 5. We get our final fraction of 1 over 80. One other thing I wanted to mention with these, when you're converting from decimals to percentages, this is really tricky. But any time that you convert to a fraction, so whether it's a percentage to a fraction, or especially a decimal to a fraction, we can always check this using our calculator. So if we just plug in 82 divided by 25, we would expect to get back this decimal right here. And if you do it, you will. But if you screw up the calculation somewhere, and you do a check where you divide these two, you'll get a different decimal, and that'll tell you that you've made a mistake somewhere. Remember that we can always go from one to the other and back, and as long as you don't make mistakes, it should always work. So if it doesn't work, that means you made a mistake, and it gives you an opportunity to check over your work and see if you can find it and fix it. So we've started with percentages, we've started with decimals. Now let's say we start with fractions and we want to convert to a decimal or to a percentage. Going from a fraction to a decimal is super easy. All you do is divide. So 77 over 200, all we do is plug 77 divided by 200 into our calculator, and we'll get 0.385. Same thing for 5 over 3. We do 5 divided by 3, 1.666 ... Or we can write this anytime we have a repeating decimal as 1.6 with a little bar over top, and this bar means repeating. So it just means that this 6 keeps repeating. So just a little aside on repeating decimals, if we have something like 1 over 6 and we punch it into our calculator, we'll get 1.666 ... If we want to write this using this bar notation, the repeating notation, instead of having to write the bunch of 6's then a ... what we do is we write out all the decimals that don't repeat, and then anything that does repeat, which is our 6, we write that out, and that gets the bar. But it's not over this 1, because the 1 doesn't repeat. Only the 6 repeats. If we have a different example, like 1 over 11, we'll get 0.09009 In this case, the 0 and the 9 are repeating, so we can write this as 0.09 with a bar over both because both parts are repeating. So 090909. So that's how we would write it with repeating decimals. Now, converting our fractions to a percentage, the book has a way of going straight from fraction to percentage, but I find it personally a little bit hard to use. I find it's a lot more work. So what I would suggest is that when you're converting from a fraction to a percentage, is to convert it to a decimal, then to a percentage. So there is a way to go straight from fractions to percentages, but it's hard. So instead of doing one hard step, we can do two easy steps. Converting from a fraction to a decimal is super easy. You just plug it into your calculator. And converting from a decimal to a percentage is super easy. All you do is move the percentage point. Our percentage should be bigger than our decimal, so that means we need to move it to the right. And so we would get 38.5%. Same thing over here. 5 over 3 is the same as 1.6 repeating. In this case, it's a little bit easier, instead of writing it with the bar, to write it with all the decimals out like this, so that when we move our decimal place, we can see really clearly what we get. In this case, we would get 166.66 ... So if we wanted to write this as a repeating decimal, we would do 166.6 repeating %. Notice we only put this repeating bar over our decimal, so even if there are 6's beforehand, we don't put the bar over them. We only use this bar for our decimals. The last thing we have to talk about is if we have a fraction %. Now, we looked at these at the start of last lesson, and we actually got to draw a few of them. But now we want to look at how we would take a fraction % and turn it into a decimal or into a fraction. So for our first one here, the big thing to understand when we have these fraction %, especially if they're mixed fractions, is that this is the same as 5% plus 1/3%. And what we'll do is we're going to take this fraction and turn this fraction into a decimal. So what we would do is say, well, this is 5%. 1 over 3, we can plug that into our calculator to turn it into a decimal. So this would be like 0.333 ... Now that these are both numbers and we don't have any fractions, we can just add these two together. We would get 5.333%. And once we have this, now we can turn this into a decimal. Remember that when we convert this into a decimal, we move it to the left because it should be smaller than our percentage. And since we have this gap here, we got to put some zeros. So our answer would be 0.0533%, or written a little bit nicer, 0.053 repeating, and there shouldn't be a percentage there because we just got rid of the percentage. So this would be our answer as a decimal, no longer a percentage. If we want to turn a fraction % into an entirely just a fraction, no more percentage, we start off with the same idea. This is like 1% plus 0.75%. So here we can plug this part into our calculator. We'll get 0.75%. So this is the same as 1.75%. Now that we have this as a percentage, we can turn this straight into a fraction by remembering a percentage is the same as the number out of 100. But now what we need to do is get rid of this decimal on top. So we're going to move this by 2 here, which is the same as multiplying by 100 on the top and the bottom. Both of these end in a 5 or a 0, so let's divide by 5. Still both end in a 5 or a 0, so we divide by 5 again. And there we would get our final fraction answer. As you can see, some of these can be pretty involved. There's a lot of steps, but you'll get practice with going between all of them and feeling confident and comfortable about how we can go from one to the other. And this way that I showed you right here for these two examples, these aren't the only way to do it. There's a lot of different ways that you can go between them, a lot of different avenues and strategies, and it's important to find out which ones work well for you, which ones make sense. All right, let's check your understanding. 4 examples here. And for each of them, you're converting from 1 to 2 different answers. So technically, there'll be 8 answers for all of this. Grab a piece of paper, really try these. And it's really important to see which ones that you're able to do easily, which ones you have a hard time remembering how to do, or which ones you don't know or understand why you do what you do, because these will be really important to recognize which ones you need a little bit more practice with. So make sure you pause the video and try these out for yourself. All done? All right, let's go over the answers. The first one, we're taking this and converting it into a decimal first. And we know that for a decimal, all we have to do is move the decimal place. In this case, we want to have a smaller number as our decimal. So we're going to move it 2 to the left. So our decimal will be 1.105. For For our fraction, all we need to do is recognize that a percentage is the same as our number over 100. Then all we have to do to get rid of this decimal place is multiply the top and bottom by 10. Basically, we're just moving our decimal place back by 1. So our fraction would be 1105 over 1000. We can reduce this by dividing the top and the bottom by 5, and we'll get our final fraction answer of 221 over 200. For question B, decimal to percentage is super easy. Again, we're just moving our decimal place, but now in reverse. So this would be 148.6%. And for our fraction, when we have a decimal going to a fraction, we use the fact that this decimal is the same as our decimal over 1, and now we want to get rid of all of our decimal places. We're going to move our decimal place 3 times on the top, which means we're going to multiply by 1000 on the top and the bottom. Both of these are even, so I can divide by 2 on the top and the bottom. And we'll get our final fraction answer, 743 over 500. Going from a fraction to a decimal is super easy. All we have to do is just plug it into our calculator. We're just dividing these two numbers, and we'll get 0.833333, which is the same as 0.83 repeating. To go to our percentage, again, we're going to turn this into a decimal first. And once we have our decimal, to make it into a percentage, all we have to do is move our decimal place. In this case, percentage is bigger than a decimal, so we're going to move it to the right. And that's how we would write it as a percentage. For our last one here, we want to take this and convert it into a decimal first. So what we need to do is think of this as 3% plus 1/5 of a percent. We can plug in 1 over 5 into our calculator, and we would get 0.2. So this is 3% plus 0.2%. So this is the same as 3.2%. And to turn this into a decimal, all we have to do is move our decimal place back by 2. And we would get our answer of 0.032, no percentage. To turn this into a fraction, I'm going to take our decimal that we've already calculated here, and we can recognize that this decimal is the same as the decimal over 1, and now we just need to move our decimal place on top. It's going to move 3 times, so we're going to multiply by 1000, or a 1 with 3 zeros next to it, and we would get 32 over 1000. Now we just have to reduce. We can divide the top and bottom by 2, since they're both even. We can still divide the top and bottom by 2 since they are both even, and again by 2, until we finally reach our reduced fraction, 4 over 125. That's the end of our video here. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure you check Teams for all the other homework and assignments, activities, and the rest, and I'll see you all in the next video.